Thank you, everyone, and thanks to Monica and those who organized this conference and for inviting me down from Edmonton. Today this is my shock and awe presentation, and no prejudice to George Bush. Sometimes I like to pretend I'm Al Gore, but I give these presentations a lot. I was in El Paso, University of Texas last week, and the presentation is basically making the argument that instead of the continuing focus on economic growth, which has been the case since World War II, we need to shift our economic and our whole thinking towards well-being and ultimately happiness. And I'll explain the reason. I was motivated to write my book by my business students at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute in Seattle, near Seattle. And this is the first MBA program in sustainable business. And they said, you know what, you've taught us in economics. We were, who really liked economics? Put up your hand. Most of us were traumatized by economics, including myself. But as I started to work in the world, first with the Alberta government from 1984 to 1999, when I ended in Alberta Treasury, working for Jim Dinning on performance measurement, I realized that the language we were using was all so the language we were using in economics and in business was, in a sense, all inverted. I'll explain that in a minute. So I have some wonderful endorsers, including Roy Romano, who gave my book a fairly high endorsement. That is, we can and we must develop our economies, our communities, based on this idea of well-being. My book was just published in China, released in January over Skype. Actually, I did my book launch by Skype from my laptop at home. And had worked with the Chinese government for 3 years on developing their national indicators. Their national economic policy is called Qiaokang, which in Confucian terms means a society of moderation, of moderately well-off Chinese. So it's not, you think the Chinese are only about growth. Well, think again, we're actually thinking in very ancient terms about improving the well-being of 1.4 billion Chinese. Robert Kennedy is kind of my hero in the sense of, here's a politician who said it best about the way we measure economic growth. He said that GNP, or the gross domestic product, measures things like locks on doors and oil spills and nuclear warhead production, but it can't comprehend the joy of our children's play or the integrity of our public discourse. In fact, he said it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. That became my credo. How can we measure progress differently? And that journey for me began in 1999, actually at Alberta Treasury when we were writing the government business plan. And we were all about introducing this new accountability framework for the province. All the photos you see are ones I've taken except one. You'll have to guess which one it is. T.S. Eliot also said it best. He said, where is the knowledge we have lost in information? We are awash in knowledge. We feed our kids all of this knowledge and information. But I think what we lack is actually one of the great virtues that Plato defined, which is wisdom. Here's Machiavelli. He was the whisperer. Of course, he documented the great Medici, right? Domination of Italy, of Florence. So what's wrong with our picture of progress is economists love curves. I call this the Viagra economy. This is the US GDP and stock market prices, stock market values. But here's a problem. In this model, as in every place, including Alberta, we have two characters. One is the GDP hero. This is the guy that drives to work in the morning, buys his lunch at McDonald's, actually has probably a car crash because he's on his cell phone and he's talking to his divorce lawyer about going through with a divorce. Now, all of these activities would add to Alberta's GDP. But the villain is a guy like me. I ride my bike every day, even in the winter. I work at home. I'm a real economist, which means economy means household manager, steward. So, and we walk the kids to school. We don't drive them to school, et cetera, et cetera. All of these activities, if no money is changing hands, they didn't add to Alberta's GDP. Now, I would argue that my lifestyle is far more compelling than spending money or time sitting in a car commuting to work and sitting in traffic and getting frustrated. We have this, we always have the Kool-Aid jug. We all drank the Kool-Aid. We believe that economic growth is the way to prosperity ever since World War II. This is a remnant of John Maynard Keynes' ideas for Britain, which was the GDP was going to measure the monetary exchange in the British economy as a basis of taxing the British people. One of the fascinating parts of this graph, though, is that purple line, which is a lot of times I spend some time educating people simply on what money is, how it's created. Money in our system is all debt. 98% of the money supply is debt. It means every loan, farm loan, student loan, mortgage, which in French means a death pledge, is contributing to our economic conundrum, which is the total amount of debt, as you can see in this graph of the United States, $57 trillion now and counting, can never be repaid. Can never be repaid. It's not like your mortgage. That means that the economy has to keep growing simply to service the interest payments on the growing amount of debt. And so that's why we see after 50 years or more now, we have this colossal mountain of debt internationally. Economies are collapsing because there's no way to get out of this conundrum except to go bankrupt. And that's what's happening to Greece, and Portugal is going next. And so this contagion will envelop the whole world. And I want to tell you that this is all unnecessary. This is something we created through our ingenuity, and we can change it. But are we going to be staring into the abyss of anarchy, or are we going to be able to say, no, we take back the sovereignty over money that we lost or gave to the private corporations called banks many years ago? 23 cents, I've estimated, of every dollar you spend at Tim Hortons is embedded interest costs. Now, if I was running for Prime Minister, I would say, I'm going to offer you 1 day off a week because I'm going to eliminate the cost of interest in your life. I think you might vote for me. I might not live very long. The Bay Street guys wouldn't like me. But it's possible. We're facing peak everything, peak oil, peak commodities. So we have some incredible challenges. I mean, this iceberg is bigger than the Empire State Building. Simon Kuznets, who's the author of the national income accounts from which GDP is derived, said that when politicians and the newspapers call for more growth, read the business section with new eyes. Every time you hear, we got to get back to growth. Kuznets said that anyone who says that must define what and for whom is this growth for. Now, the work I did in the United States, where we actually tried to adjust the GDP for environmental and social depreciation costs, because some of these things like a car crash or cancer is not a healthy sign of a healthy society. Would we not identify those as potential regrettable expenditures and then deduct them from the GDP? When we make some of those adjustments, we get a far different well-being or genuine progress index, the red bars. And then the environmental depreciation costs are in the negative territory. So we're actually drawing down on nature's capital. I told Jim Dinning once, we operate this province without a balance sheet. There's no accounting of soil health, of how many barrels of oil are left, how many cubic meters of natural gas are left to heat our home, how many years. How come? That's probably the most important asset we have. When we did the Genuine Progress Indicator for Alberta in 2001, when I was with Pembina Institute, we had the greatest compliment from Ralph Klein, which was no comment. So when Ralph was silent, I knew that we must have been speaking some type of truth, that Albertans could see themselves in this graph, which says even though the GDP has kept growing per capita, the overall index of well-being measured by 50 indicators that would probably be intuitively attractive to Albertans actually has been lagging, if not stagnant, for many years. And this is a new balance sheet. If we're going to have a balance sheet, we have to think in terms of circles, in terms of relationships between and amongst indicators. These are the 50 indicators. If you go back to this graph, every one of those points on the Genuine Progress Index is one of these. So each graph is like a flower. Now, a perfect flower, if Alberta was totally healthy, this flower would look like a perfect flower, but it doesn't. Some of these petals are wilted, like suicide and family breakdown and crime rates and problem gambling. We have some healthy signs, of course. Spending a lot and disposable income is reasonable. We seemingly have more free time. That's sometimes questionable for some of us. and we're living longer. So there's positive and negative aspects to this new balance sheet. As in any balance sheet, you have to weigh assets and liabilities. There's another problem. Here, when we start to contrast GDP with other indicators of progress, we see this recent graph I did for the Alberta Land Use Framework, which shows the connection between, or the visual relationship between GDP and cancer. And the R-squared on this is very high. That doesn't mean there's causality, it just means it's interesting. Now, the original business plan, as I tell American audience in the United States, was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So how are we doing? In the United States, there aren't any more very happy people than there were back in the 50s, in fact, or back to the 70s. So why do we keep needing to grow and make more money if, in fact, the business plan maybe is already maxed out? Notice Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. When we look at, let's map GDP and self-rated happiness around the world and draw fit a line through there, you could see that Canada and the United States are way out there. Luxembourg, actually Alberta is right next to Luxembourg in the far right. But little Bhutan, which has the gross national happiness as their national policy, a Bhutanese kingdom, a Buddhist kingdom run still by a king, 1/15 the GDP of the United States per person, but high rates of self-happiness. And here's Alberta compared to Vanuatu. Vanuatu is a Polynesian island in French Polynesia. And they're descendants of headhunters. But they got the Happiness Planet Index Award 2 years ago. So the Tahitians invited me down to advise them on how they could be more like the Vanuatuans. So it's just don't get back to headhunt. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the economist at the World Bank, said his GDP has failed to capture factors that make a difference in people's lives. So he's working with President Sarkozy of France to envision new measures of well-being for France. We actually have one of these already for Canada. We just don't have the political will to implement the Canadian Index of Well-being yet. These are our daughters, Renee and Stephanie. It's time for new curves that look like this. Actually, your happiness curve looks like this. You're happiest about between birth and 12, then you hit puberty and go in a trough. And then you come out of your trough about 45. It's probably when your mortgage is, right? When your pledge unto death is already, paid off. And your kids are gone off to university and you get back to traveling or whatever you left when you were 13. So actually happiness does look like a smiley face. The questions I ask just like a kid, like why do we get all the language wrong? Economy, this is our home in Edmonton, means household management. Ecology means household knowledge. Value means to be worthy or strong, not just monetary. And what about virtue? Thomas Jefferson said, without virtue, happiness cannot be. The word wealth, which is the title of my book and my model, means well-being conditions, and from the 13th century Old English term. And everyone, including Adam Smith, has forgotten this. I explained maybe Adam Smith was biased against the English because he was Scottish, so he wanted to ignore the fact. The English actually define the word wealth. But in the entire book, The Wealth of Nations, he doesn't define the word wealth. So, and a close cousin to wealth is actually the word capital. We use capital a lot, but one of the definitions is wealth in whatever form used or capable of being used to produce more wealth. And my favorite word of all, competition. This is a picture of Venice where competition was alive in Venice. Competition means to strive together. When my business students graduate from my class, they're all messed up, right? So yeah, you finance, the art of war, right? It's like, what about the art of collaboration, of cooperation? How about mimicking the ecosystem like a forest? So I have a dream, just like Martin Luther King, and that's to develop an economy where the outcomes are enduring happiness, where ultimately we're going to develop a civilization of love. Sounds squishy for an economist, but wait till you see my t-shirt. Now, people like John Paul II weighed in on this and said that authentic development can never be attained solely through economic means. In fact, he said, what has become the idolatry of the market, a consequence of the civilizational consumption, reduces persons to things and subordinates being to having. We are having people. We're not being people. When are we going to learn to relax, chillax, that we live in one of the most prosperous places on earth, and we still feel compelled to get every last barrel of oil tomorrow, or every bushel of wheat needs to be exported because that's the business model we've been using since the Hudson's Bay Company or the British East Indian Company came here. The business model hasn't changed at all. We're still exporting our so-called comparative advantage without any thought to whether we actually have to or need to. So he would argue that we need to focus on the spiritual nature of the human person, a renewed appreciation of the moral character of social and economic development. And that's critical. I think what we have forgotten is virtue. None of us in our council meetings, and whether it's in the cabinet of the Alberta government, ever probably talk about the 4 virtues that Plato defined. Moderation, which is about sustainability, justice, wisdom, and courage. I ask every audience I go to, I was in El Paso last week, how many people know the 4 virtues of Western civilization? Nobody puts up their hand. That means we've all forgotten. How do we forget the wisdom of moderation? Why is moderation, why should it be a virtue? But instead, we believe something else. So in this model, in order to live authentically, live according to our values, we need to get in touch with our values. That means we need to have a conversation. We need to spend time meeting with each other over soup, on Sunday with the neighbors, talking about what makes our kids tick, what motivates them, what are their dreams, what are their aspirations. And that takes time, sitting in circle, having conversation, passing a wooden spoon or a talking stick. Let's try that. We can do that. So her daughter Renee, we were in Hawaii a month ago. And, but Ruskin also said it. He said, life, there's no wealth but life. Life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. An economy of well-being is one in which households, businesses, and communities are resilient, flourishing, and joyful places to live and work, where stewardship and maintenance of the integrity and capacity of all the 5 capitals of our oikos, of our households, is the primary objective. Imagine if economists really focused on the well-being of your household. Where's Paul? Paul's not here. Imagine if the city of Edmonton really cared about my 100-year-old house, the integrity of its foundation and how long it would last, and the sewer lines and all that stuff, and there would be actually a real replacement schedule. That'd be cool. That'd be real stewardship. But that doesn't happen. Oh, we wait till the sewer line collapses and then you get an emergency crew because you're backing up in your house. We even fail on the basic management of our infrastructure. So the 5 capital model I envision looks like this. It's the morning glory flower. Five aspects of capital. So these are portraits of my genuine wealth. This is me going to Germany when I was 3. My dad, before he left from Hamburg to come to Canada through Ellis Island. My grandfather's watershed, my mom's father in Austria, in which they still drink the water untreated from the mountain, from that watershed up there. My grandfather's brother's son's house, off the grid in a little mountain community in Austria. My chief happiness officer. We all have chief happiness officers, right? It's my wife. Our household, our garden, where we play in Mill Creek Ravine. Hiking and climbing mountains with our neighbors in Jasper. Working with the Chinese government. These are some of the senior Chinese economists working on new indicators of Chao Kung society. My mentor, John Cobb Jr., who inspired me as well to write this book, Methodist theologian from California. Drinking espresso in Italy. Eating real food, slow food. Italians don't eat frozen vegetables. Learning how to cook with our Sicilian cook in Tuscany, and eating and enjoying family, and sitting outside. This is a Tuscan landscape. Agricultural landscape, hearing roosters in the morning. No jet planes, no cars. Roosters and dogs. On the New York Times, why do we play? The Buddha said it best, our purpose of our lives is to be happy, isn't it? Happiness is the aim of life, Jefferson said. Virtue is the foundation of happiness. Utility is a test of virtue. If the wise be the happy man, as the sages say, he must be virtuous too, for without virtue, happiness cannot be. If we forget virtue, we cannot possibly get on this track back to happiness. In Bhutan, I was just with some Bhutanese students in El Paso. El Paso has the largest, probably, number of Bhutanese students per capita in anywhere in North America. All the campus buildings are built in Bhutanese architectural style. But in Bhutan, happiness is the national policy. It is contrasted with GDP because there's still a belief in Bhutan that Buddhist principles underscore the ultimate foundation of society, and that's about spiritual fulfillment. The Dalai Lama said the purpose of economic development must be the pursuit of true happiness that enables true happiness. But guess what? We don't actually have a happiness index for Alberta. How come? How come they're tracking us every day? At Tim Hortons or something, right? It's like there should be a happiness index in Lethbridge. Right? It probably won't change that much, but there'll be stories around your happiness. That'll get people excited about, gee, I can do something different tomorrow. Now, I'm a forester as well, so nature for me is the perfect model of sustainability because it looks like this. Notice the pattern of that orchid. It's a holonic pattern. It's an infinity curve. It's not an upward sloping Viagra curve. So what happens when we get back to what we might call matrifocal, which would be to say, where are you on this infinity curve? That becomes the issue. Where's that forest? If you're a forest, are you at the fire stage? Are you at the climax stage? Are you at the new generation stage, the seeding stage? Those are the things we have to think in terms of our new models. We need to think in terms of less efficiency. We have this cult of efficiency, which actually becomes brittle, like the banking system, and begins to collapse. But increasing to this area of efficiency, which in Alberta will mean that every community should be resilient, diverse, unique, have its own celebration of comparative advantages, and where even the idea of exporting things becomes questioned when we actually are focused on local resilience. Now, Thomas Aquinas said that what is required of the good life are two things: sufficiency of material goods and virtuous action. There again, virtue again. So sometimes I wonder, gee, when George Bush was president, did he go to bed at night like Ben Franklin did? Ben Franklin had a checklist of 13 virtues, personal and social, that he went through every night and said, did I live up to these? Which ones did I not live up to? This is nothing new. But virtuous action is definitely what is required. Now, some of these ideas of moderation can be difficult to sell in Alberta, won't they? We're so used to growth. We're so used to getting whatever we want. We're so used to thinking, we can extract 5 million barrels a day from the oil sands and not care about the people downstream, or just write it off because, hey, that's the cost of development and we're entitled to it. So it turns out there is a science of happiness. This stuff isn't just squishy. Psychologists have been thinking about this. Happiness actually has been exploding in the books since, well, not that I started the wave in 2007 with my book, but there's a whole raft of happiness books now. Even Bernanke, Federal Reserve Chairman, at the commencement speech at South Carolina University, actually, I got to have a speech, got it yesterday. He's talking about the economics of happiness. So when Bernanke starts talking about happiness, either it's like, better head for the exit. But happiness, Aristotle said, is a sense of well-being resulting from achieving excellence and fulfillment of one's functions. So when we think about education, are we teaching our kids in school to be able to discern why they're here on this planet? What are you here to do? What's your vocation? Your voice, you're in this choir. We don't all have to be the same, but when we start to examine the purpose of our being, then we will have a different society. So in terms of this, that's the Colonel's secret, recipe for happiness. 50% of our happiness is derived from our genetics and the quality of our upbringing, our childhood. That fellow on the left there is my friend Leonard McCallum, who was an alcoholic, drug user, lived on the streets of Edmonton and East Hastings in Vancouver for 25 years. He's an example to me of someone who can overcome enormous economic and social challenges and still attempt to define a life that is actually flourishing for he and his family and for a lot of Aboriginal people. The good news, the best news in this wonderful saying this in the university is only 10% of our well-being comes from how much we make and how many PhDs you have or how much education you have. And probably the best news is 40%, and the fact that we can affect the most relates to our relationships. The strength of relationships, sense of our belonging and trust of each other, sense of community. That is what really is the key factor that we can actually affect. We can create conditions in which we have better trust. Trusting societies have less litigation. They have less of these social costs, like the Norwegian country or other Nordic countries tend to have less inequality and more trust. So these things can actually be measured and monetized. What puts a chill on our happiness is the loss of our loved ones or loss of jobs. So unemployment is a happiness killer. Now, this is what we might call the blueprint for how do we do this genuine wealth assessment. This is the process I used with the city of Leduc and Leduc County. In 2006, we released the report for the city, and we started with, we used this process. Now, the process looks more like an accounting system because I'm a former auditor as well. So we need a balance sheet, we need an income statement as the full cost accounting of our decisions. They have to be driven by maybe virtues, certainly values. And then we can develop a genuine well-being report that is delivered to citizens every year. So first of all, virtue. Here are the 4 virtues of Plato. Now capitalism, I would argue, well, I didn't argue this, it was Amatore Fanfani in 1934, who was Prime Minister of Italy, President of the United Nations in the 60s, said that capitalism has these unique characteristics, that it rationalizes that the capitalist lifestyle is the best means for improving his or her own position. The possessor sees no problem with obtaining increasing without limit or reproduction at diminishing cost. So this idea of utility maximization, what economists call, I always say, what is a udel? Actually, Bernanke's, so the mic went off. Maybe the battery died. Which one was for the camera? Where's the
power should have been elevated to it.
Does that work? Technological difficulties. It happens when the capitalism slide goes up. So I'm just going to keep talking. None of this is new. The Jews had ethics of incredible economic ethics. Before they went into exile in Babylon in 585, these are some of the characteristics that they believed that all wealth came from God. So that we had a responsibility not just to God, but to each other. There was an ethic of, there was a Sabbath when the land was allowed to rest every 7 years. There was, of course, the 7 days, and the 7th day was meant to rest. And then there was Jubilee, which actually was, what was Jubilee? Anyone remember what Jubilee is?
Slaves were freed every 50 years.
Excellent. What else happened? Right. Well, you've heard me speak before, right? No. But it's no, it's true. So all the wealth of the 12 tribes is redistributed, right? Tribes were allowed to gain power and prosperity amongst their clans, but there was a notion that redistributing this wealth and forgiving debts was the only way to maintain cohesion. We're way past Jubilee. We're 65 years after World War II, and now we're suffering, right? And nobody knows what to do. Because who's going to go first and forgive each other's debts, right? That's the conundrum we're in. The Europeans can't do it with their union. Are we going to do it? Or are we going to say we're going to reboot the whole system? We're going to write a check for $5 trillion. Flaherty's going to write the check tomorrow. And all the debts are going to be wiped off the books of Canadians. Canadians On average, $42,000 per person in debt. That was the latest stats that came out, CBC reported yesterday. When are we going to have the courage to do this? Who's going to go first? That's the problem. So look at these are the Jewish ethics. They believe that, thank you, each individual was responsible for the damages caused by one's body or property. Now, interesting enough, the Jews seem to have forgotten these ethics when they came back from Babylon. Or, I don't know, I've worked with the Madoff victims in New York who got burned by Bernie Madoff. I say, you're all Jewish families. How come you're not talking about this? We're the rabbis. So what do we value requires some maybe surveys, conversations like circle dialogue. These are the questions we ask citizens of Leduc. Why do you choose to live in Leduc? Why are your kids leaving? Was the question the mayor wanted me to answer. So we went and asked those questions. Working with the Inuit, the elders, we went to the elders. It's like going to your seniors' lodges and asking your parents or grandparents, what defines Alberta? This is what the Inuit told me. Being useful in service to others, dialogue, teamwork, learning by observation, creative problem solving. Those are the fundamental core values of Nunavut. Why? Because these are understood to define a flourishing society. So when we begin to measure what matters, we need to think in terms of flowers. This is the new balance sheet. So we got the individual flower, the personal well-being flower, which probably looks more like a medicine wheel from Aboriginal First Nations thinking, spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. We have flowers that make up a bouquet called a household, and we have other bouquets that make up a community, and ultimately we have a community flower. These are just some examples of how we would measure well-being for communities, and this is the work I do for communities. So there's 5 forms of capital. There's human capital, which includes our skills, our competencies, motivations, even happiness, how we use our time. We can track all these things. We're spiritual well-beings. This is the owl that flew at me near Danton off of Highway 22. I don't know what it means, but some say it's a bad omen. It was on Blackfoot country. So the medicine wheel looks like this. And guess what? It suggests balance and harmony. The Inuit elder said if your spiritual side is imbalanced, your medicine wheel wobbles. It's like an imbalanced tire. This is the well-being checkup report for Leduc. I had to use little character faces to make it easy for politicians to understand. So in case you get, bamboozled by the numbers. But the right-hand column actually is comparing Leduc against Alberta in most cases. So if you're above 100, you mean you're better than Alberta on average. And if you're below so we have, some problems. We have obesity. We have perception of being overweight is better than the actual obesity index. So people are more bullish about their weight than doctors might say. And we used 120 indicators against the 5 capital model. We asked kids to tell stories about what they love about being in Leduc. And these are 2 of my favorite stories. I mean, Tara Spice was with me in some of this work, where we actually went and spent time with seniors and listened to their stories about their memories about living on the farm and all that. Our social capital is our relationships, our networks, our sense of belonging. Here, the self-rated sense of belonging of Leduc citizens, the sense of trust. How, do you trust your neighbors? Natural capital, where I spend most of my consulting time. This is a map of Leduc County done by Alberta Ag Canada, one of the only maps I know in the country which shows those red polygons where we should be growing our food. Anything called the farm assessment rating, anything ranging from the yellow to the purple is where we should be concentrating our agricultural production. But I learned that we don't actually have any information or sufficient information on what is actually being produced on those polygons at the quarter section level. How is it that we have all the statistics in the world, we have ag census, and we can't tell you what Farmer Joe is producing on that red polygon today? And moreover, I can't tell you whether that production is going into Edmonton farmers markets. I learned there's only 7 organic farmers in Leduc County. And yet there's growing demand for farmers markets, so where's all this production going? This is a market in Innsbruck, Austria, where every food item is labeled as to place of origin. There was not one food item in this local market which came from anywhere else further than Sicily. It was all fresh. Here's a map of Canada's boreal forest in terms of integrity. The red, I colored red because it represents the linear disturbance, seismic lines, roads, forestry that's cutting into the boreal. What about watershed accounting? What about treating our accounting framework becomes the watershed for Lethbridge or for Red Deer or for Edmonton or Saskatchewan Basin? Basin level planning. We're about to release the Canadian Index of Wellbeing Ecological Ecosystem Health Report in the summer, and it will hopefully have these kind of maps, so you can punch in your postal code ultimately and find out what is the health of the sub-basin that you live in. We've mapped, for example, how much carbon is sequestered by each water or sub-basin in the country. The red being actually negative releases of carbon, and the dark green being the most important carbon sinks. We can map soil organic carbon within watersheds. We can then contrast that with greenhouse gas emissions and tell Canadians that we're running a very significant ecological carbon deficit. We don't have a balance with nature. And most of that problem is right here in this problem. We can map out the most toxic watersheds. There's mine, and little red Edmonton on the east outskirts where all the refineries are, the highest concentration of toxic releases. Now in Bill Capital, we think we do a good job on this, but I've already said that even my home isn't really on the books of the City of Edmonton in terms of its integrity of its infrastructure. And lastly, but probably most importantly, financial capital. Now, what's happening in Alberta is household debts are now in excess of disposable income. Most of us know that, or we know someone who's in that graph. That's an unprecedented level of debt. And it even exceeds personal spending now. In Edmonton, this is the work I just did for the City of Edmonton for their planning process, is the median family income, the blue line, pretty much stagnant in real $2,008, and yet average household debt climbing. The interesting thing is actually there aren't any debt statistics at the provincial level or the municipal level. There's only one table for all of Canada on debt. How can this be when debt by definition is the money supply? So in this, what I imagine my wildest dreams is an accounting system, a monetary system, which banks are, the focus is on local economy, where money is created in parallel with the needs of the local economy. Also in relationship with a national currency or national central bank, but really the focus would be on person-to-person lending. And these are things I've been exploring with colleagues in Edmonton, just brainstorming, how can we become each other's bankers? What would that look like? What if we were the local monetary fund, deciding on what are the needs for maintaining the 5 capital assets of our community, and then figuring a way of creating money, encouraging credit unions to lend on the basis of real need. Not 10 cafes, maybe only 5 cafes, because that's all that can be supported. So I've been encouraging Van City, biggest credit union in the country, to think this way. So think in terms of returns to well-being, not just, default rates, sure, but what about well-being returns to investment? Here's a bank in Sweden, my friend Oscar, who runs the interest-free bank called JK Bank, Land, Labor, and Capital. That's what it stands for. It's the only bank in the world outside of Islamic banking. Guess what? Muslims cannot pay interest. It's forbidden in their religion. But we've accepted it. It's called usury. We've accepted it for a long time. But the JK Bank stands as a beacon of hope. What about investing locally? What about taking all your money out of Wall Street or Bay Street and putting it into Lethbridge or wherever your community is? Can you imagine how much money would come home? There'd be so much money you probably wouldn't know what to do with it. But that's kind of what I envision. Instead of speculation, a casino economy, which we currently have, what about genuine investment? What about figuring out where that money should be best placed to ensure a flourishing local economy? And Leduc's new balance sheet. It's kind of cool what you can do with Excel graphs, isn't it? These are all Excel graphs, by the way. So this is the City of Edmonton's melt sheet. I could show you a QuickTime little movie which shows you from 1981 to 2008 this flower changing. But this gives you a very quick picture of the overall state of well-being of Edmonton in 2008. Here's Edmonton's overall well-being index. Now the city chief economist hired me to do this. And so this is the first city in North America to actually have a genuine progress index at the city level. And here's GDP, which didn't look that good last year, but the overall index of well-being hasn't recovered since its peak in the early 80s, but still it is recovering. We have some problems though. We have family disputes, family violence going up with GDP. Ecological footprint is increasing. So in terms of a planning process, this is how all of this might look. This is the City of Leduc's. They asked me to integrate this into their business planning process so that it would guide decision making from the business plan on an annual basis to long-range plans. So every maybe 2 years you would have a refreshing of the database, so you'd look at the trends, changes in the well-being conditions. That would then drive and inform the annual strategic planning process of City Council. It's my friend Dominique Michaud who at 19 years of age asked me to be his mentor and then proceeded to say I'm going to run as a statesman for office and is now the deputy mayor of Leduc. He and I meet regularly at the Sugar Bowl where I wrote my book in Edmonton to talk about real democracy, which is about listening to people as to their needs on their doorsteps. That's how he won. He came in 3rd overall in that election, and he's running again this year. But he believes that the future belongs to his generation, but he's sitting in rooms with 50-year-olds like me who probably don't care about the integrity of the infrastructure, but he does because he's going to inherit it. So he's always thinking long-term and thinking about making Leduc the best place to live for his children. So their new frontiers, the Canadian Index of Well-Being has been kind of under development for 10 years. We have, there are going to be 8 domains, we'll call domains of well-being. 4 of those domains have already been reported out to Canadians, but no political party has adopted them, neither at the provincial level. So we're doing better than the French, actually, in terms of implementing some of this stuff. Even Gallup is getting into this. In the United States, Gallup every day now polls Americans as to their well-being. And that includes life valuation, emotional health, physical health, healthy behavior, work environment, and basic access to basic needs. So this is pretty cool. And they're doing it at the state and at some cities as well. I think the future belongs to economies like Emilia-Romagna in Italy, the breadbasket of Italy, where the slow food movement, anyone heard of the slow food movement? That's where the slow food movement comes from, which is celebrating local. It's where Parmesan cheese comes from, balsamic vinegar. Pavarotti was born there. Ferrari operates out of there. It's the cradle of Roman civilization. It's based on a pretty simple model, which is to believe that efficiency, equity, and reciprocity are held in equal balance. It's a remarkable model. 15,000 business cooperatives operate every day and strive together, as the word competition says. And these are the economies I like to believe that would become models for Alberta. And Alberta has a history of cooperatives. We just seem to have forgotten it. What about this economy of communion, the Focolare movement, also out of Italy? These are the characteristics of this economy, where profits are equally shared amongst the members, and 1/3 of the profits goes to the poor in the community. Business people like Ray Anderson, who has an adage, doing well by doing good. People like Jessie Reddy's, who is an amazing businesswoman in Edmonton, runs a Blue Pear restaurant. I'm on her new board called Live Local, thinking about making sure that we can produce our own food and reduce our dependency on high fossil fuel input imports, and do a little bit of import substitution even. So let me finish with the secrets of happiness, which is really pretty simple. To want what you already have and to live the life you've already been given. At the end of the day, are we going to be able to tell our children or grandchildren that we did our best to ensure that the economic development of this province brought us improved well-being and joy? And the last word goes to John Maynard Keynes, who said on his deathbed, "If I had to do it all over again, I would have drunk more champagne." Thank you.